Subscribe to Iron Age Instincts right now, because what we're about to cover is the kind of history most documentaries skip. Not battlefield tactics, not famous generals, but the quiet decisions made in kitchens, cellars and barns that determined who survived the war years and who didn't. While millions of soldiers went hungry at the front, families at home were hiding foods that governments rationed, neighbours betrayed each other over, and black markets quietly revolved around. This wasn't hoarding, it was calculated survival, passed down through hard experience. If you care about real history and real preparedness, stay with me, because this knowledge still applies today. The reason hidden food mattered more than ration books ever did. Official rations looked fair on paper, but anyone who lived through the war knew they were never enough. Soldiers often received calories without nutrition, while civilians faced long gaps between distributions. Families who survived learned quickly that survival depended on foods that could be hidden, preserved, traded, and eaten discreetly. These foods weren't obvious staples. They were chosen because they didn't spoil easily, didn't smell when cooked, and didn't draw attention. That logic is just as relevant now for anyone serious about resilience. Why root vegetables quietly kept entire households alive. Potatoes, turnips and beets became underground lifelines, literally. Families buried them in root cellars, under floorboards, or in garden pits layered with straw. Unlike bread, they couldn't be easily counted or confiscated, and they provided steady calories when rations failed. A sack of potatoes could be stretched into soups, pancakes, or boiled meals without smoke or strong smells. Today, the lesson is simple. Calorie-dense foods that grow underground are harder to detect, easier to preserve, and far more reliable than processed supplies. How dried legumes replaced meat without drawing suspicion. Beans, lentils and peas were quietly stockpiled because they stored indefinitely and replaced protein when meat vanished. Soldiers rarely saw them in sufficient quantities, but families soaked and cooked them slowly, often at night, to avoid attention. Combined with small amounts of fat, legumes sustain muscle and energy for years. Modern preparedness mirrors this exactly. Dried legumes remain one of the most efficient long-term protein sources when refrigeration, supply chains, or income collapse. Why animal fats were hidden more carefully than gold. Butter, lard and rendered fat were among the most dangerous foods to possess, yet families risked everything to keep them. Fat meant calories, warmth, cooking ability and nutrition. Many hid it in sealed jars, buried underground, or disguised as soap or animal feed. Soldiers starved because fat was prioritized for the front, but civilians who secretly retained it survived winters that killed others. Today the lesson is, well, uncomfortable but clear. Fat is survival fuel, and modern low-fat storage thinking ignores historical reality. How honey and sugar quietly replace currency. Sugar was rationed heavily, yet families who hid honey or molasses gained both calories and bargaining power. Honey never spoils and could sweeten bland food enough to keep morale intact. It was also traded discreetly for clothing, medicine or information. Soldiers rarely saw sugar, while civilians with access to beehives quietly prospered. In modern terms, shelf-stable, morale-boosting foods still function as barter assets when money loses value. Why did preserved dairy stay hidden, even though there were constant inspections? Well, cheese, especially the hard and aged varieties, became a sort of hidden cornerstone of survival. Families would wrap wheels in cloth and wax, storing them in cool cellars where, honestly, inspectors rarely searched thoroughly. Cheese provided fat, protein and calcium at times when fresh milk simply vanished. And soldiers, rather ironically, often went without these nutrients, even though they were out there fighting for years. For today's survivalist, hard cheeses and powdered dairy offer much the same kind of nutritional insurance. So, here's the thing. Grains stayed invisible even when bread basically disappeared. Whole grains like barley, oats and rye berries were just a lot easier to hide than flour or bread, Families would grind them quietly by hand, often at night, just to avoid detection. Grain meant independence from bakeries and those long ration lines. While soldiers depended on these centralized supply chains, families with grain, well, they simply did not. The modern takeaway is pretty straightforward. Whole grains store longer, resist pests better, and let you produce food without drawing attention. So, why did preserved fruits prevent sickness more than, say, actual medicine? Dried apples, fermented cabbage, and preserved berries kept people from getting those nasty vitamin deficiencies that honestly killed quietly. Soldiers often suffered from scurvy-like symptoms, while civilians who had access to fermented or dried produce just stayed healthier. These foods were super easy to disguise and, well, required no fuel to eat. Even today, fermentation and dehydration are still some of the most reliable, low-tech food preservation methods around. Now, what did WWII families really understand that modern folks often miss? These families didn't hide food out of greed. They did it because, well, systems collapse a lot faster than people expect, and survival belongs to those who plan quietly. They prioritize foods that didn't announce themselves, didn't spoil, and could be divided without waste. The lesson here? Build reserves that don't rely on electricity, obvious packaging, or daily resupply. Learn to store food the way people did back when failure was guaranteed, not just hypothetical. If this kind of real, unfiltered history matters to you, go ahead and subscribe to Iron Age Instincts. Share this with someone who thinks preparedness is just paranoia. And keep this knowledge alive. History doesn't repeat, but hunger always returns when people forget.